So today we're talking a little bit about the holiday that our Muslim sisters and brothers are celebrating. And it's one of the two holy feasts in Islam. But it's about sacrifice. And sacrifice is not a word that evokes a lot of happy feelings for a lot of us, right? It evokes different feelings for people depending on the context that it's used in. It can raise thoughts of horror or fear, or it can be thought of as a noble act on behalf of other people. It's usually hailed as a necessary ingredient of religion or of success on one hand, and there's a lot of mistrust around the idea of sacrifice. I think particularly in our liberal religious tradition, we have mixed feelings about it. But it's in the news today a lot as we're being asked to sacrifice some of our comfort to help contain and eliminate, for example, the spread of the coronavirus. And some of us are willing to make that sacrifice. Others are not quite so willing to do that. So as I said, today's the third day of al-Adha, the Feast of the Sacrifice. And it's one of the two Eids, the great Eids in Islam. The other is Eid al-Fitr. And I hope later on that Amir will tell me if I'm pronouncing these absolutely correctly, because otherwise I'm embarrassing the heck out of myself in front of him. But this Eid al-Fitr occurs at the end of the month of Ramadan, which is the month of fasting. Eid al-Adha is considered the holier of the two. And so when if you see somebody today, because maybe if they're Muslim and you know them, you could say Eid Mubarak to them and wish them a blessed Eid. And since our liberal tradition draws from many sources, I thought it would be a good time to think about this idea of sacrifice as our Muslim sisters and brothers are celebrating this holiday. We don't often draw from the Islamic tradition too much when we speak in our Unitarian Universalist sermons. Sometimes we draw from the Sufis, like we read Rumi, who was a Sufi, but he was a Muslim, but not too much from the Qu'ran. And today the story is from the Qu'ran. It's Eid al-Adha is the celebration of the reflection on the story of God asking Ibrahim. In the Quran, he's Ibrahim. In the Torah, he's Abraham. And he's asking Ibrahim to sacrifice his son. And that's found, as I said, in both the Quran and the Torah. In the Torah, the story is known as the Aqidah, the binding of Isaac. But there are some differences. The Quran teaches, and Muslims believe, that Ibrahim was asked to sacrifice his eldest son, Ishmael, not his younger son, Isaac, as taught in the Torah, and what both Jews and Christians believe. Ishmael was the son of Hagar. I think it's Hajar in Arabic, I'm not sure. She's known in the Quran. And Hajar had been Sarah's handmaiden, her slave, really, her slave. And perhaps you recall that story from the Hebrew text. And it's similar, so I'm going to just explain it a little bit. Abraham, or Ibrahim, was a faithful servant of God, and he and his wife had no children. And they were getting old, and frankly, they were getting desperate for a son who could take care of them in their old age. So Sarah, in desperation, told Abraham, "Go and take my slave Hagar and have a child with her." And so Hagar gave birth to a son, and they named him Ishmael. And without going into all of the details of that story, which differs a bit between the Quran and the Torah in some ways, a few years later, God sends an angel to tell Abraham, who is now 99 years old, that Sarah, who is also very old, is going to have a baby. She's going to have a son. And Sarah laughs at this. And still, of course, as any good myth and any good legend will happen, she does have that son. But she becomes jealous of Hagar now, the slave who had Ishmael. And so she has Abraham send Hagar and Ishmael into the desert. Presumably she wants them to die. But God takes pity on them both and they're rescued by an angel who leads her to an oasis where there's water. And then you know what happens. God tells Abraham to sacrifice, or Ibrahim to sacrifice his son as a test of his faithfulness. Now, again, this is how it's told in the Torah. But in the Quran, Isaac hasn't been born yet. And so God tells Ibrahim, I want to pronounce it the right way and for the story's sake, to sacrifice Ishmael. But he doesn't tell him directly. Abraham tells Ishmael that he's had this vision of being told to sacrifice him. So he's giving his son the news. You're about to be sacrificed. Is this right? Should I do this? He asked him. He said, what do you think about this? And Ishmael willingly goes to be the sacrifice. But just as in the Torah, God turns the hand of Ibrahim. The knife is turned, and he doesn't sacrifice Ibrahim, and God instead provides a sacrifice, a goat. In the Torah, it's a ram, I believe, but God provides a goat instead, telling Ibrahim that it was all a test, and he's passed. Now I have to confess that whether it's from the Torah or from the Quran, this is not one of my favorite stories about God. I just find it creepy. And I've never been a big fan of blood sacrifice in any tradition for any reason. I just don't think it's what a God that I would worship anyway would do. But as in Judaism and the bringing of animals to be sacrificed to the temple, in Islam on Eid al-Adha, an animal, usually a goat, is offered as a sacrifice. And the tradition is that it's then divided into three pieces. Part goes to the family that it was for the sacrifice, part goes to some neighbors, and the other part goes to the poor in the community who need food. Now, around the world today, most Muslims, particularly I think in the United States and the West, they're not sacrificing their goat. There are people who do that, and they have it divided for them, or they contribute money to, they're one of many organizations that will do that sacrifice for them and split it for them, or they donate money to pay for a sacrifice for another family. And in recent years, some Muslims, particularly younger Muslims who live in the West and who may not eat meat, or they don't like the idea of killing animals, they're finding other ways to offer a sacrifice. Again, through offering a donation of money or offering food to the poor in the community. So that's how they're doing their sacrifice. The English word sacrifice comes from the Latin word sacrificium. And that simply means to perform the priestly rites of offering something to a deity. And in ancient times, ritual offerings and sacrifices to the gods were a part of everyday worship. In Mesopotamia, for example, sacrifice was provided to the gods for the necessities of life. For the Israelites, who were in that same geographic region, they had their own idea of sacrifice. Their worship was closely tied to making sacrificial offerings, and the priests implemented sacrificial rituals, and they only used certain kinds of vegetables and certain kinds of animals. And the animals needed to be unblemished, just like they do in Islam. Sacrifice was about giving your best as an offering. So the Feast of the First Fruits, for example, in Judaism, where they would bring the first offerings of the wheat grain, and the bread, they would bring bread and so on and so forth. Sacrifices showed honor to God, and most importantly, they were a path, a ritual path to encounter the divine. And so for those people, showing an external ritual of sacrifice wasn't enough. Sacrifice had to change the person internally too. There was a meaning behind it. Although we know that most times, even in the Christian tradition with the sacraments that we have and everything, they become almost rote, right? We do them, people do them, they baptize people, they take communion, most of the time without thinking about what's behind all of that ritual and the reason for that ritual. But what can we take away from the story in the Quran that on the surface seems disturbing to some of us? So we just have to set aside our feelings of horror or whatever it may be, and we have to look at the story itself as the myth that it really is. And I'm speaking here only about the part pertaining to the sacrifice of Ishmael. And so first there's the idea of willingness, right? For Abraham, his willingness to sacrifice Ishmael was a test of his trust in God, or at least that's one interpretation. And it's a test that he passed, the Quran says. And then there's the idea of risk. Abraham believed that the dreams he was having, the visions he was having, were Allah telling him to sacrifice his favorite son, his only son, Ishmael. In the story in the Quran, again, he tells Ishmael about the dreams, and he asks what Ishmael thinks about this. And Ishmael tells him that he should do it because Allah was asking it, and that he, Ishmael, was willing to be the sacrifice. Now there's risk for both of them, right? Both of them could be wrong. Remember, in the Quran, Isaac hasn't been born yet, unlike in the version in the Torah. So Abraham is taking a big risk here. He finally has that one son who's going to take care of him and Sarah in his old age. In fact, the Quran is clear that this doesn't happen until Ishmael is ready and old enough to work alongside Abraham. But if he sacrifices his son, he runs the risk of not having anybody around to take care of him and Sarah. And he runs also the risk of having to live with the doubt that he was wrong for the rest of his life. He'd have to live with that. Not many of us, I think, would be willing to take that risk. I know I wouldn't. And Ishmael is taking a risk too, because he could be wrong. And, well, he could be dead for no reason. So it was a risk that they were both taking, which raises the question, at least in my mind, who was doing the sacrificing here? Yes, Abraham was the one who's going to perform the sacrificial rite that he believed Allah wanted. But that's the only reason he was doing it. He was being tested, and he wanted to pass the test and to please Allah. And of course, it wasn't easy for him, and he struggled with being willing to do it. But there would be no one else to benefit by it, right? Ishmael, on the other hand, was the one who was willing to offer himself up as the sacrifice so that his father could pass the test. In Surah 37, where this is found in the Quran, we read this. It says, then, when he was old enough to accompany him, he said, "Oh, my son, I see in a dream that I am sacrificing you. See what you think." He said, "Oh, my father, do as you are commanded. You will find me, God willing, one of the steadfast." Then when they had submitted and he put his forehead down, we called out to him, "Oh, Abraham, you have fulfilled the vision. Thus we reward the doers of good." This is God speaking here, Allah. This was certainly an evident test. And then it says, and we redeemed him, meaning Abraham, with a great sacrifice. He provided a goat in place of Abraham. That's what that word redeemed meant. Redemption means given something in exchange, to buy back. It seems to me that Abraham was engaging in an act of self-denial, denying himself his son and what his son could afford him. But it wasn't an act of self-sacrifice. Ishmael, on the other hand, was engaging in an act of selflessness, an act of self-sacrifice that would redound to the benefit of his father and his mother. This is sacrifice in a religious context. And a common definition of sacrifice, though, is an act of giving up something valued for the sake of something else regarded as more important or worthy. It's about difficult choices in secular as well as in religious context, right? Sacrifice is about the path that's not taken and what was given up in order to pursue another direction. And with deep sacrifice, there's often a lot of grief and pain and loss, perhaps. And there could be sacrifice in heroics. We know that, right? We can think of soldiers, for example, on the battlefield we've heard about, who sacrificed themselves for their fellow soldiers and friends. That's deep sacrifice. That is not a self-denial. It's a sacrifice of oneself for the benefit of other people. Or we can think of people who, you know, for example, push someone out of harm's way when a train is coming or a car is coming on a busy street, even at the risk of their own life. There's a kind of sacrifice that we have when friends or family members may, or people we don't even know, offer an organ as a donor organ. And many of you are organ donors. In our own UUCP community, we've seen that in the past couple of years, right? The great sacrifice that was entailed. So in those examples, sacrifice still includes risk. And in these times of difficult choices, it's really impossible to have it both ways. We feel pressured in making the choice. There's a time of the reconciling of big things right now. This past week, we all watched probably the many tributes, I did anyway, the many tributes to Representative John Lewis. And we heard about the many times that he, along with many others, risked his life to win the battle for Black Americans and people of color to have the right to vote and to be accorded the same rights as every other citizen. There was enormous risk, and he was willing to take it. We all know about his experience on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma and other places as well, where he was beaten and jailed and treated badly. He was a man of great faith. And when confronted with injustice and bigotry and with hatred, he was willing, like Ishmael, to say, "You will find me willing, one of the steadfast." He was willing to sacrifice himself for the benefit of others without any thought of his own reward. I think that we sometimes use that word sacrifice pretty casually. You know, we say, for example, that someone in business or in sports or the entertainment industry, they got where they are because of great personal sacrifice. And certainly there may be some element of sacrifice involved. The young athlete or the aspiring actor may miss out on the typical school experience or social activities that most kids have. Or the business person may miss out on the joys of a typical family life. But those aren't forced choices, usually, unless a parent forces a kid to do something like that. Usually those are not forced choices. John Lewis said that he couldn't refuse the call to offer himself, to sacrifice for the cause of justice. Sacrifice is an act of giving up something valued, as we said before, for the sake of something else regarded as more important or worthy. In our own liberal tradition, we can think of people, we can think of Theodore Parker, James Reeb, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner. We can think of Dr. King and Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman. So many others who would not refuse the call of sacrifice. What do you think of when you hear of sacrifice, the more difficult type of sacrifice? How do you react? Do you admire it? Do you resist it? Can you empathize with those who are willing to sacrifice? More importantly, I think we have to ask ourselves, how do we react when we believe that we're being called to make that kind of difficult decision in sacrifice? Not all of us are going to face those extreme difficult decisions. More than likely, for most of us in our age, we're not going to necessarily face that, but we don't know. It's becoming more apparent that some of us may today face something like that, at least possibly in the near future. I think about how the idea of mail-in voting, for example, is being opposed by those who don't want everyone to vote, who are doing all they can to force people to the polls, even during a pandemic, and who are trying to have mail-in voting abolished. And that's blatant voter suppression. I don't think they'll succeed, but if they do, many of us will, if we don't get a ballot to do that, many of us will have to face a difficult decision. Do we go to the poll and vote, or do we not? I mean, I'm willing to take that risk if I have to and march myself down to that polling station. I'll crawl over crushed glass to exercise my vote, especially this time. I mean, unlike John Lewis, I doubt there will be anybody there who's going to beat me with the billy club. But it's a risk all the same because of the pandemic, right? We may be called to sacrifice for others, for future generations. We're called to engage in radical self-sacrifice. That doesn't necessarily mean putting ourselves in harm's way for no good reason. We still need to keep safe and socially distant and wear masks and all those other things. But when the call comes, when we have that dream or that vision, what then? What will our response be? I hope and that may we, like Ishmael and John Lewis and so many others who have gone before us, that we be found willing and one of the steadfast. May it be so.